that we released last week. This was the Powering the Future report on what 50 years of enhanced geothermal teaches us today. And the webinar today is for a specific US audience. Of course, if you are outside the US, we welcome you to this webinar as well. Anne, could you take us to the next slide, please? So today's speakers, will be me first. I am Angela Seligman. I am Clean Air Task Force's senior geoscientist. I will start by providing some highlights of our recent report on powering the future with enhanced geothermal systems. I'll also, for those of you a bit newer to geothermal, I'll give us a background at the start just on geothermal energy in general, and then I will hand it over to my colleague, Anne Garth, who is also with Clean Air Task Force. She is our senior geothermal associate, and she'll give us a background on policies and regulations in the US and how they impact geothermal across our country. And then to wrap things up, we're really excited to have Mary Dillon from Fervo Energy. She is their strategic lead, and she will be giving an overview of the recent successes that we're really excited to see from Fervo Energy in the US. Next slide, please, Anne. So to kick us off first, we're going to go through some background on geothermal, and then I'll give us some highlights from our recent report that we released. And next slide. Okay, so to kick us off, I want to sit on this slide for just a bit. What we have here are various heat extraction methods. This is where I want to dive us into some background on geothermal. So when a lot of people think of geothermal energy, they typically think of conventional geothermal systems. This is where you have all of your typical things already there that you think of when you think of geothermal energy. This is your fluid is readily available underground and has enough cracks within the ground to be able to flow through it and heat that fluid up so we can bring it back up to the surface to produce electricity. This is typically what we think of when we think of geothermal power plants, but not everywhere around the world has all of these components. And this is where we get to next generation geothermal energy. And these are the two graphics that we have on the right side of the slide here. In the upper right, we have enhanced geothermal systems. This is one type of our next generation geothermal energy. And in these enhanced geothermal systems, we don't have all of those components that we typically think of when we think of conventional geothermal systems. So in these enhanced geothermal systems, we have to enhance or engineer the rock underneath the surface to create our own reservoir. This is what's shown in that figure in the upper right side of the slide. And then with that, we can create the cracks under the ground and then bring our fluid in to be able to pump that fluid down, let it flow through those cracks, heat the fluid up, and then we bring it back up through a production well. And this allows us to create our own geothermal system. Some companies who are kind of leading the way and we typically think of, at least right now when we're thinking of enhanced geothermal systems, are Fervo, for one, who you'll hear from later in this webinar. There's also Mazama, and then there's also the Utah Forge project. This is in Utah and is a Department of Energy funded research project where we can test out the creation of and an improvement of enhanced geothermal systems. The other type that I just want to touch on briefly is closed-loop geothermal systems. This is another type of next-generation geothermal systems, but the big difference here, and these are shown in the lower right side of the slide that we're looking at here, is that instead of the fluid coming into contact with the rock, these systems are created by drilling a series of pipes through the ground that are long enough so that as the fluid flows through those pipes, again, not coming in contact with the rock, but it can pick up the heat that is going from the rock through the piping material to the fluid, and then allowing that fluid to heat up and then be brought back up to the surface. So this is another type of next generation geothermal energy, and some companies who we use as examples here are Ever, Greenfire, and XGS. And Anne, can you take us to the next slide, please? So with that background, I want to dive into our Powering the Future report. This report was built on a comprehensive database of over 100 historical and current enhanced geothermal systems projects worldwide. And I might bounce between enhanced geothermal systems and EGS throughout this webinar, but I'll try to use a bit of both so that everyone can remember what EGS stands for. This report was also built out by over 400 sources. This includes research reports, press releases, news articles, and personal contacts. And it pulls together decades of both incremental improvements and also the more recent transformative advancements that we're seeing in enhanced geothermal systems that are driving the now hundreds of megawatts that we have under development. And what we really are excited to see from this report is that EGS, our enhanced geothermal systems, are really no longer experimental. These are projects that are scaling and growing across both the US and globally. And before we dive into the graphs that I want to showcase in this presentation, I also just want to flag my co-author on this report. This is Jason Lipton, who really did a lot of the legwork leading up to the creation of this report. And so I just want to flag his involvement in this as well. Next slide, Anne. So I want to start out with this figure here, and then some of the other figures that I'll be showing are a bit more technical, but I promise to walk you all through each of these figures one by one. This first one showcases one of the really exciting pieces of this report, and this is that over 100 enhanced geothermal systems projects have been built throughout the last 50 years, and this is really showing a track record of steady progress and breakthrough innovations over time. And so this figure that we're looking at here has project year on the horizontal or the x-axis. And then we have two different vertical axes on this figure. One on the left side is the number of projects by continent per year. So you can see that these are broken up by the Americas, Asia, Europe, and Oceania. And then the vertical axis on the right side is the cumulative count of the projects. So this is what's counting up to that 103 projects that we have in the report. And what's really exciting to see here is one, that we have over 100 projects, but also the really great increase that we're seeing in the early 2000s of increase in project development over time. So next slide, please, Anne. This next slide is looking at drilling speeds and how really recently we're starting to see a really quick increase in these drilling speeds. This is also called the ROP, our rates of penetration. So in this figure, we have drilling year on the x-axis, and then the ROP in meters per year on the y-axis. Again, this is the rates of penetration. And in a few of these figures, we have some sort of threshold or baseline value. In this one that we're looking at here, this is the well cost simplified threshold. And this is a threshold of just under 10 meters per hour that we're using as a comparison from previous research, where we're saying this is kind of something that we're aiming for or showing real improvements. And you'll see something like this on a lot of the other figures that we're looking at. But the real key that I want to point out here is that we see over time in these early projects, they were all under 5 meters per hour for their rates of penetration. But more recently, after around 2020, we're seeing a really impressive increase in these rates of penetration, specifically in those seen from Utah Forge, as well as the Cape Station points are also associated with FERVO. So really seeing those impressive increases in rates of penetration in more recent projects. Next slide, Anne. The other piece here is that we're seeing drilling costs falling really quickly as well. And so this is part of why we want to see those rates of penetration improving, because those are not the only piece that impacts our drilling costs. Of course, there are other aspects that impact those, but with an improvement in the rates of penetration, the really important piece there is bringing the cost down of the project. And one of those aspects that we're seeing here is that decrease in drilling costs. And so in this figure, we're looking at measured depth in meters on the horizontal or the x-axis. And then on the vertical axis, we're looking at estimated drilling costs, and this is per well. And kind of like that last slide that I was showing, we have some scenarios or baselines that we're looking at for comparison. So we have a base scenario, an intermediate scenario, and an ideal scenario on this slide. And of course, we're aiming for that ideal scenario, those lower and lower costs. And what we're seeing, although the time is not shown in this figure, what we can see is that we are seeing some of these projects getting closer to that ideal scenario. Specifically, we know these Cape Station points are more recent points on the plot, and we're seeing those starting to get closer to that lower ideal scenario that we're aiming for. Next slide, Anne. The next piece here is projects reaching higher production temperatures. And we aim for this because we know at higher temperatures, we get more, it's kind of a more bang for your buck. You get more energy than per well than you do for a lower temperature project. And so on this slide, we are looking at project year on the horizontal or the x-axis, and then project temperature on the y-axis. And again, we have one of those thresholds or baselines on this plot as well. This is a threshold from the 2006 MIT report. This is at 200 degrees Celsius. And what we can say is we still don't have a lot of projects getting above that threshold that we have on this plot, but we are seeing increases over time where before 2000, we were seeing significantly lower temperatures on average than we are seeing after 2000 on this plot. And I do like to preface in this figure, as well as in the next one that we'll look at, that not all of the projects included in this graph are necessarily aiming for higher temperatures. And so there's a lot of things that come into play here where maybe if the projects are just looking for heating, home heating or industrial heating, they might not be aiming for quite as high of temperatures. And then there's also aspects in terms of geology and other local conditions that have an impact on the temperatures that these projects will get to. But the important piece that we're looking for here is that increase in production temperatures over time. And next slide. So this next slide it looks a little bit different than some of these other ones, and that's because sometimes geologists or people who work underground, we like to make our graphs so they're going below ground. And so that's why in this graph here, we have the drilling or recompletion year it's again on the horizontal axis, but this time we put it at the top. So now our vertical axis is looking underground. And so this is the well measured depth, and the negative numbers are going deeper and deeper below ground. And so in this graph, the really key piece to look at here is that our enhanced geothermal systems wells are now drilled more than twice as deep as the earlier projects that we were looking at. And so we can see that over time and more recently, we're getting to deeper and deeper wells, which is really what we want to see in terms of the ability to get to deeper wells at a lower cost where we can reach higher and higher temperatures. Next slide, Anne. And so this next slide is looking at production flow rates, and that we're seeing really good increases over time in these production flow rates. So in this figure, we are looking at project year on the x-axis, and then production flow rates. This is in liters per second on the y-axis. Again, we have one of those benchmark lines on this figure. This is at 80 liters per second. What's really great in this plot is that we're seeing continually increasing production flow rates over time, but we are still not quite getting to most projects being above this benchmark line that we're using for comparisons here. We are seeing that some of these newer projects, like the estimated rates at Cape Station, are getting to be above those production flow rates. But we still want to see continual improvements over time, and we still have some work to do on these production flow rates. Next slide, Anne. So I know there's a lot of points going on in this last figure that I want to showcase here, but I think it's a really useful one to look at for comparisons. So on the horizontal axis on this graph, we have the primary purpose. This is looking at field research, so really early stages on the left side, and then full-scale deployment on the right side. And then on the vertical axis, we're looking at project year going from earlier on the lower end up to later and more recent on the upper side of this figure. And what's really notable to see here is that we're seeing so many more of these field research projects in the earlier stages, and that we're over time getting to more commercial demonstration and full-scale deployment over time in this figure. And so this is the really key point of this figure, is that we're starting to get to those full-scale deployment projects. Next slide, Anne. So before I hand it over to my colleagues, we've shown a lot of really impressive improvement so far throughout this presentation, and this is really noted in the report, and I don't want to diminish this at all, but what we really want to advocate for here is that we're not quite all the way there. So scaling requires continued technical, market, and policy advances. And so I've broken this up into a few different buckets of areas that we need to continue putting more energy into. And one of these is on co-production opportunities that can help to bring down those early high costs that we see in these next generation geothermal projects. This is in terms of having some sort of thermal or heating piece associated with the project to provide heat, as well as co-production in terms of minerals such as lithium. So trying to add another component to these projects. And another piece is the need for continued work on better understanding the longevity and reservoir decline management of these projects. So making sure that we can and we understand how they will act long-term throughout the project's life cycle. The other piece is on market and recognition. And one of these is on the need for the full recognition of the unique value that enhanced geothermal systems bring to the market. And this is in terms of the ability of these projects to provide clean baseload power anywhere that we may need them. And along that same line is the need to be able to have these projects anywhere that we may need them. So this is in terms of geographic expansion and not just having these projects in regions where there is a shallow heat source. But being able to have these in like the mid-continent where we have to continue drilling deeper and deeper to get to that heat source. And really to help with the expansion and advancement of this technology, another piece that we need is improving data transparency and standardization to avoid having repeat mistakes from multiple operators, where if we can share data more transparently and have it be understood across the board, that we can avoid having these repeat mistakes. And then the last bucket is on policy and investment. And this is along the need for increased commercial and research investment into this technology, as well as stronger policy and regulatory support. And with that, I think that is the perfect transition to hand it over to my colleague, Ann Garth, who will take us through an overview of policies and regulations in the US. Take it away, Ann.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, so much for having me. I am excited to share a little bit today about policy work happening in the United States on next generation geothermal. Before I jump in, just a couple of disclaimers. Firstly, apologize for my scratchy voice. I have strep throat, but I am so excited about geothermal policy that I wanted to be here anyways and share some things with you. I only have maybe 10 or 12 minutes, so I'm going to give a high-level overview of bills and policy efforts in the last two Congresses. So there will be a lot of bills mentioned. I'm not going to be able to dive into each one, but I can give a sense of kind of what we're seeing at the federal level. I am going to mention a lot of bills. Me mentioning a bill does not represent any sort of endorsement from myself or CATF necessarily of that bill, but rather just explaining kind of where things stand right now. And then finally, I will focus mostly on the federal piece of the puzzle here. There is a lot of really important state work happening, and I'll mention some of those efforts as well, but there's a lot more to dive into in other forums. So with that, some of the overall trends we see in geothermal policy. I think what's really exciting is that geothermal energy has strong bipartisan support. Most of the bills I'm going to cover in the next couple of slides are bipartisan. And this is all something that just when CATF is on the Hill, speaking with folks, there's a ton of support for geothermal from both sides of the aisle. It really does kind of have something for everyone. The sort of flip side of that is historically, geothermal has not received a lot of attention. There's a lot of people who like geothermal, but they haven't necessarily worked on it or really focused on it. I think that's really changing in the last couple of years, especially this Congress and last Congress, because of all of the technical successes that have just been laid out, right? I think people are starting to realize that geothermal is a real thing that has huge potential. It's not some pie in the sky concept. It's an energy source that's available and could, dramatically and rapidly scale. And so we're seeing a lot of policy attention. None of the bills I'm about to mention have actually passed, so there's definitely still work to be done on the legislative front, but we do expect there to be continued momentum on geothermal in the months and years to come. So with that, I'm going to go through some slides showing some of the key topic areas. And the first one I'm going to mention is permitting and environmental review. So there are kind of two challenges here. One is regulations don't account for new technologies. So a lot of geothermal regulations, especially at the state level, and permit requirements were developed for conventional geothermal. And they're not accounting for the new developments that we've seen with EGS and with closed loop, new technologies, new approaches. And so they need to be updated to take into account what the best practices are, all of the different ways you can do geothermal now. And we've seen some really exciting work at the state level in a couple of states. So Texas and Colorado recently updated their geothermal regulations to kind of account for, deeper and potentially for dry rock, kind of next gen geothermal. We also are expecting or hoping for updates soon from Nevada and California, and hoping for more states to kind of take up that as well. It's a really important issue. The other challenge related to permitting and environmental review is needing a regulatory structure that can protect the environment and human health and ensure safe development of geothermal, but also that can move projects and permits and reviews through the process quickly enough that you can actually get geothermal deployed in the field in time to start contributing to the energy mix in the US. And, a number of folks in the geothermal community have felt that the review process is pretty slow and has historically been pretty slow. And so are there ways to speed it up that would, help more projects deploy quicker? And there's been a lot of interest in this on the Hill. So multiple different approaches. We've got some bills that require agencies to respond to geothermal applications within, 30 days or 60 days. There's also a whole bunch of bills which would exempt geothermal projects from NEPA review under certain conditions, and the details of exactly which types of projects get exempted under which conditions vary from bill to bill, but overall there's interest in exemptions from NEPA. We're also seeing some proposals around staff capacity, which is a really key issue area of not having enough staff who are trained on geothermal. So there's been a bill to create a strike team, which would essentially give technical assistance to BLM and help them kind of get smarter on geothermal, as well as a bill for cost recovery, which would enable additional staff capacity that could be used to, increase the staff who understand how geothermal works and can kind of process those applications. So there's a whole bunch of legislative action. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention agency action. So kind of in the same vein, BLM at the very beginning of this year finalized a categorical exclusion from NEPA for geothermal resource confirmation activities. So that's based on a record of past safe development that has already gone through BLM. They've now developed a categorical exclusion. Early indications from industry suggest that that process is going to help speed up permitting and environmental review processes, but it's only been a couple of months, so that's something we're going to be tracking closely and looking forward to seeing kind of how that affects the process and timelines. So next up is leasing. We have an issue here where federal lease sales for geothermal leases are infrequent. They're supposed to happen every other year in states where there are sites that have been nominated, but that doesn't happen. They happen much less frequently than that. And obviously that slows down project development. If you can't get a lease, then you certainly can't do a project. So there's been a couple of efforts to kind of address that. One is some bills which would require annual instead of every other year lease sales for geothermal. And also a bill that sort of straddles the leasing and the permitting issue, which would designate priority leasing areas for geothermal and would help streamline the process to get those leased. So this is something people are definitely thinking about. Excuse me. A couple of other barriers and policy solutions. First is on mapping. So the issue with mapping is that most of the geothermal maps of resource availability have been developed in years past when there was really focused on conventional geothermal. And when you have the ability to do geothermal in dry rock, like EGS or closed loop, it dramatically expands the map of where geothermal might be possible, how much geothermal potential might exist. And the mapping just simply hasn't caught up with all of the technological advancements that we've seen. And so we really need additional maps that are going to be able to focus on dry rock, next gen, EGS, higher temperature, all of these new advancements. And of course, mapping costs money, so there's some funding need there. We did see a bill last Congress, the Supercritical Research and Development Act, which would have funded USGS to do some additional mapping of these sort of higher temperature next generation resources. There's also a really important need for R&D. And there's kind of two pieces to R&D. So one is innovation in new technologies. So things like, building new materials, new tools for things that are not quite at commercial scale yet. So for example, higher temperature resources, accessing those is going to require different tools and materials. Not all of those exist yet. So there's definitely a need for R&D to help bring those along. CGF has done a lot of work in that area with our Bridging the Gaps reports if people are interested. But it's also really important when we think about R&D for technologies that exist right now but are expensive. So bringing costs down by developing more cost-effective materials is going to help bring the overall cost of a project down, which is obviously really important for deployment. And so as we're thinking about that, there's kind of different pieces that we need. And What makes it tricky is that geothermal is really expensive to test compared to other renewables, for example, like wind or solar. The way that you ultimately test something is you have to test it in real world conditions, in the conditions it's actually going to be used. And so that means for geothermal, you have to go out and drill a well and put your new material, your new tool down the well and kind of see how it performs. Drilling wells is really expensive. And so there's a really key need for in-field testing and test beds. Angela mentioned Utah Forge earlier in the presentation. This is a DOE-funded testbed that was wildly successful at its goal of de-risking EGS. So kind of more work along those lines is really important. And there was a bill last Congress which would have funded R&D grant programs, both for earlier stage resources as well as for commercial stage technologies that need to become cheaper. So that's a really important area that we're tracking closely. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is deployment. So the challenge here is what we call the missing middle, which is a common issue for industries and sectors that are just getting up to commercial scale. And the issue here is basically the first projects, sort of first commercial scale projects, are expensive. And over time, as you deploy more projects, you learn, costs come down, advancements are made, and it gets much cheaper. But of course, the first couple times you do something, it's going to be harder and it's going to cost more. And so you need an off-taker or a buyer who's willing to pay those high costs for the first couple commercial projects so that you can deploy them and have the learnings from those projects and then, keep bringing costs down. And so there's this financing risk where there aren't a ton of people who are willing to fund those early stage kind of first of a kind commercial scale projects. And this is, I think, a really important area that has been really underlooked at the federal level. California has really been the leader here. So the PPA graphic that was in the report, as you can see, in 2021 and 2022, there's a huge jump in PPAs and for geothermal projects. And this is mostly, potentially, almost entirely attributable to a requirement that California passed in 2021, which was requiring utilities to procure a certain amount of clean, firm power. So that was almost entirely filled by geothermal, as it is a firm baseload source of power that is zero carbon or very low carbon. And that has been an incredibly important driver of the growth in the geothermal industry. Seeing those PPAs come in has given a lot of confidence. There's an offtake, there's a signed agreement. It really helps with the financing. So that's been a major factor in the growth of next generation geothermal in the last 5 years, has been that California mandate. And the other piece on PPAs that's really important is big tech. So we're also seeing a number of PPAs from large tech companies for AI or data centers, and those are also really making an impact. So deployment is an area where we see a lot of need. And in general, I think there's been a big focus on permitting and leasing, and those are incredibly important areas that need to be addressed. And there are improvements to existing processes that can speed up geothermal development. But we also are looking at other areas like mapping, R&D, and deployment where there hasn't been quite as much focus, and we think that's also really important. So we're looking forward and hoping that there will be continued work both at the federal level and the state level across all of these topic areas to help geothermal reach its full potential. So with that, I will hand it over to Mary from Fervo.
Thank you both, Anne and Angela. And I'll just keep telling you when I need to go to the next slide. But thank you, Kata, for making it possible for me to be here today and talk a little bit about what Fervo's doing and how we are trying to really revolutionize the geothermal industry and bring clean, firm power online. And if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, actually, I think you can just go one more. So I want to start off our short presentation today about realigning what Fervo's mission is. So our mission is to leverage innovation in geoscience to accelerate the clean energy transition by providing cost-effective, reliable geothermal energy. And on my next slide, Anne, I'm going to go into a little bit of how we're doing that. So I'm going to actually start on the left-hand side of this slide and kind of give some quick facts about Fervo itself and our evolution as a company from 2017. So we were founded in 2017, and we've been around for the past 8 years to really revolutionize and pull a lot of learnings from the oil and gas sector into the geothermal sector. We're based in Houston, Texas, with a few satellite offices across the Mountain West. But we are headquartered there to really pull on the oil and gas workforce and upskilling those workers from the Houston Energy Hub to bring them into geothermal. We to date have 658 megawatts of contracted offtake. We have take-or-pay PPAs or power purchase agreements with a handful of really great offtakers, notably Google, Shell, Southern California Edison, and NV Energy. And we take a data-forward approach to development. And this really aligns with what Angela is saying on data sharing and making sure this is an industry-wide push for growth. We really take a data-forward approach in our own development, as well as sharing data across the industry. And we have a differentiated business model. So we have end-to-end ownership of development, construction, and operations of our assets to make sure that we have control over our performance optimization and long-term value of our geothermal plants. Angela really hit on in her introduction why geothermal is so important and the distinction of EGS, but a couple highlights here are geothermal and next generation geothermal specifically is extremely scalable. We have a very robust supply chain that we can pull from the oil and gas industry, as well as build out reservoirs that have gigawatts of resource availability to be able to build out very modular and scalable projects. It's also very cost competitive with alternative power options, specifically looking into data center offtake, which is kind of the current buzzword in the energy industry. And it's completely carbon free. It also has a lot of bipartisan support, which Anne mentioned, and it's available now, which is a huge benefit to geothermal technologies compared to some of the alternate clean firm offtake potentials. Right now, we are scaling our Cape Station power facility under construction, and it's scaling to 500 megawatts by 2028. And next slide. So to take a step back and talk a little bit about the difference between traditional hydrothermal or geothermal systems and what Fervo is doing. So traditional hydrothermal systems, you have two vertical injection wells that you would use naturally occurring fractures to move a working fluid geothermal brine across those fracture networks to sweep the heat in the subsurface and then produce that up. You're heavily reliant on what is naturally occurring in the subsurface, and that is where next-gen technologies, notably Fervo's enhanced geothermal system technology, comes in. We are now engineering our own subsurface fracture network. So rather than drilling two vertical wells, we're drilling horizontal well systems that are hydraulically stimulated to connect and create that subsurface fracture network that can produce high enough flow rates and temperatures to produce electricity at the surface. Go to the next slide, Anne, and I'll get a little bit more in depth on specifics of Fervo's approach to EGS. So we have a really great graphic on the right-hand side to show where we're drilling, how we're drilling, and kind of some reference points. We're drilling about 8,500 feet in the subsurface vertical depth with laterals that are then fracked to create a subsurface network. That fluid is then produced at the surface at high enough temperatures to generate electricity. So step one, we drill wells vertically and then horizontally, and then engineer those fracture networks. Step two, we pump fluid in the subsurface down the injection wells to flow through those fractures. Step three, as it flows through those fractures, it sweeps the heat into the fluid in the surrounding rock, which is then returned to the surface through our production wells. Step four is at the surface, the fluid is run through a heat exchanger where heat is transferred to a working fluid that is used to spin a turbine and generate electricity. And then step five is 100% of the geothermal fluid is pumped back into the injection well, creating a closed loop cycle where water is not lost to evaporation. None of Fervo's processes require fresh water and can take advantage of degraded water sources such as brackish water that we would drill on site. All right, next slide, Anne. So this approach really helps revolutionize how much geothermal energy potential the United States really has. So on the left-hand side, we have a graph showing the conventional geothermal resource across the United States. You're very limited to where those naturally occurring fracture networks are located, close enough to the surface where you can access the temperatures and flow rates necessary to generate electricity. With an engineered subsurface model like Fervo's EGS approach, you're able to just look at where it's hot close to the surface. So you're taking one of those variables out of your equation, and it dramatically increases the potential of geothermal expansion across the United States. All right, to talk a little bit about Cape Station, which is our first greenfield project located in Southwest Utah. We'll begin selling power from the first phase of this project in 2026, and the second phase of this project will come online in 2028. Currently, we're under construction of that first phase. We have drilled over 85% of those wells going towards Cape Phase 1, and we've completed cross-flow tests for 2 of those well pads. For power plant construction, we have equipment being delivered on site and installed on site. We're rapidly expanding our construction efforts out on our Cape Station site. We have a really great picture of our air-cooled condenser being installed there. That is what's going to be used in our working fluid system in our organic raking cycle power plant to reset that working fluid so that it can continuously generate electricity. And we are actively taking deliveries on site to receive all of the major critical equipment like ACCs, like I mentioned, as well as drainage tanks, preheaters, and generators. And we're significantly reducing, by already having a lot of that equipment on site, our tariff exposure as we continue to see tariff fluctuations in the supply chain. Next slide, Anne. Great. So Angela showed a graphic of rate of penetration of geothermal wells across the industry over a time period. Here is specific data for Fervo drilling results, kind of turning that metric a little bit on its head. Rather than doing rate of penetration, we are talking about days versus depth. So on your vertical axis, you have measured depth, and then on your horizontal axis, you have number of days it took you to drill that. As you can see, we're seeing a dramatic increase in our learning curve as we drill well after well. We're getting faster and faster, learning more about the subsurface geology, continuously iterating on the tools that we've used, as well as the approaches and procedures that we're using to make sure that we are really maximizing how much we can drill per day of a drill rig rental. Next slide. All right, so just to round out our overview of Cape Station, so phase 1 is 100 megawatts and phase 2 is 400 megawatts. Like I said earlier, those have commercial operation dates in 2026 and 2028 respectively. We fully contracted out both of those projects for 15-year power purchase agreements, which is very standard for the industry. And we are well on pace with construction of Cape Phase 1, as well as starting construction of Cape Phase 2. And it wouldn't be possible without our industry partners to make sure that we are being able to execute on these projects effectively. Have a list of a handful, but there's definitely more. We have a ton of industry partners that we definitely use as support as we continue to work through our project development. Next slide. So to show a comparison of CO2 emissions per megawatt hour of electricity produced, we have a handful of renewable and traditional energy sources listed on our graph on our left-hand side. Fervo is sitting at a high capacity factor and low emissions, so it's very similar to nuclear and wind in terms of grams of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. And then when you're looking at traditional geothermal systems towards coal, you see a distinct increase in emissions per energy produced. We also make sure that we have zero freshwater consumption. When we're talking about development in Western geographies in the United States, those are typically very water scarce regions. And so we want to make sure that we are being as good of community partners as we possibly can be, and making sure that we are not using any of the fresh water that could otherwise be used for municipal use or agriculture use. So we use exclusively brackish water that's not suitable for either of those two use cases. And we are a non-water consumptive technology with all of our water returning to the subsurface in our geothermal system. We also are making sure that we are good community partners in terms of seismic risk as we're going through our hydraulic stimulation or fracking portions of our development. We have a stoplight system that is very robust to make sure that any seismic events that are initiated from our site do not fall do not fall above a certain magnitude. And if they do fall above, we have a robust community engagement protocol, as well as stopping operations and making sure that we understand what happened. As you can see on this graph, we have earthquake magnitude, as well as date since Fervo started simulation operations. There's tons of natural seismic activity in the area, and our induced seismic activity is highlighted in red, which is really not anywhere close to what the baseline would be in this area. So we're making sure that we are communicating this with our community, as well as making sure we're safe community partners. Next slide. And then Anne gave us a great overview on the different policy headwinds, tailwinds, and barriers that we need to go after to make sure that we truly unlock this next generation technology. A few items I want to highlight is the fact that in 2025, we've seen a huge legislation support push. So we have a handful of things. The one I really want to speak on is the One Beautiful Bill. While solar and wind credits phased out sooner coming out of that One Beautiful Bill, geothermal keeps its original schedule through 2036, which came out in July, and that was a huge win. Making sure that we have available tax credits with bipartisan support for those tax credits is crucial for us being able to scale up this industry, not just as Fervo, but as an entire industry, putting more clean for electrons on the grid. And then my last slide is actually a video of one of our crossflow tests out at Cape. So the steam that you're seeing is hot steam going through a silencer and a muffler on site. This is true proof that our geothermal system in the subsurface connects and is producing high enough flow rates as well as temperatures. Yeah, hopefully there's a couple different angles, but it might be a little glitchy with the Wi-Fi. But that our geothermal system connects, and we're seeing that connectivity at the surface. Thank you. I believe we're opening it up for questions now. I'll pass it over to you, Angela.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. And also thank you, Anne, as well. Really appreciate the presentations from both of you. We have had quite a few questions coming in throughout the presentations. I've taken the lead on answering some of the nice and simple ones as they have flowed in. But maybe to start out with, Mary, there was a question that I think you can maybe just answer really quick at the start. It's about measured depth, and what measured depth is versus, as compared to when we're thinking about typical depth below the Earth's surface.
Yes, I'm on mute. Yes, definitely, I can take that. So total measured depth is inclusive of both the vertical and horizontal portions of the well, whereas a metric for just total depth is called total vertical depth. So that'll tell you how deep you are in the subsurface, where total measured depth will tell you the combined, what you have actually drilled through.
Yeah, thank you so much. We also have a couple of questions that Mary and Ann, I know both of you spoke to this throughout your talks, and that is the bipartisan support that we are seeing for geothermal, which love to see the rare bipartisan support just in general. But could both of you maybe just quickly, Mary, I'll hand it over to you first, just maybe showcase a bit more on the bipartisan support that we are seeing for geothermal energy.
Yeah, and I think Anne might be able to speak a little bit more in depth in terms of an industry-wide push. I can speak at a very high level. So we're seeing a lot of across the aisle support. We're operating in a vast majority of states that have local legislation bodies that have both Republicans and Democrats, as well as up on the Hill in Washington, D.C. And we're seeing a lot of interest in how geothermal can be both part of American energy dominance, as well as a clean, firm power source on the grid. And I believe just the nature of our energy source and how we are framing ourselves to those policymakers is really helping us unlock a lot of things that would not be available to us if we were just across one aisle.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. Anne.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'll mention, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but seeing a ton of bipartisan geothermal related bills in Congress, yes, none of them have passed yet, but that's pretty rare. Like that's not something that really happens a lot. Obviously we live in a very polarized time with political parties who have pretty different opinions on a lot of things. And so folks who aren't maybe super, on the Hill all the time might not quite recognize, but it's just a really meaningful signal of interest that you have people joining together who are working on, R&D and permitting and leasing and all of these things. It's also something that you just really hear it when you talk to people, right? Like, CATF goes into a lot of meetings, other NGOs go into a lot of meetings, and the excitement that we get, the enthusiasm we get when we talk about geothermal, the value proposition that is exciting to people is different, right? So when we talk to Democrats, they tend to be really excited about producing a lot of renewable energy, and that's great. When we talk to Republicans, they tend to be excited about producing a lot of energy that is domestically produced, that uses oil and gas workforce and supply chains and is, made in the US. So those are both accurate. They're just different benefits of geothermal. So it kind of does have something for everyone, but what it has is maybe a little different, depending on which side of the political spectrum folks are coming from.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne. There's a couple questions about not seeing projects in different regions around the world while we were showcasing various projects in our recent report. I do want to preface, maybe just as a reminder, this report is specifically for enhanced geothermal systems. So if you're not seeing maybe one of your favorite geothermal projects, we did not include conventional geothermal projects in the report, and we also didn't include closed loop geothermal projects in the report as well. So not to necessarily answer every question on that, but that could be why you didn't see a specific project showcased in our graphs. And I want to maybe some other conversations on maybe kind of the need to. It seems like geothermal is having its day in the spotlight right now, which is great. Um, and uh, and I think really it's worth it. It deserves the attention that it's getting as a really important source of clean and baseload electricity. And I'd like to pass it over to you to maybe speak to how we can kind of keep it that way. If there is certain care that we should take moving forward to ensure that geothermal energy continues to advance, hopefully at the speed or better as it has been recently.
Yeah, that's such an important question. A lot of other technologies we've seen have community opposition or concerns raised. And I think what Mary was talking about earlier in terms of the best practices that Fervo follows are a really shining example of how to do this right. And there are a lot of other companies and operators who are also doing that. So, ensuring that communities are informed, that they know what's happening, that they're seeing benefits to them. With every energy source, there's always some level of risk. So as Mary mentioned, being really careful about managing those, and there've been a lot of projects that have really successfully done that. So ensuring all of those pieces is really crucial for helping communities feel the benefits of a project in their area. CATF has some videos coming out soon that are going to kind of lay out what some of those benefits look like and how communities can really be looped into that process. But it's such an important area where developers, I think, need to be kind of following best practices and doing the right thing to maintain that strong support from the grassroots, individual communities level all the way up to, policymakers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne. Mary, I think I'm going to do my best to combine a couple of questions here and ask them over to you. You mentioned in your presentation something that I don't think it's just me that loves to see. There were kind of two things that you touched on. One was zero CO2 emissions out of Fervo operations, and another one is around your care for water, water usage and water consumption. And there's a couple of questions on kind of maybe if I put it very generally is how you do that, how you can have the zero CO2 emissions. And I should broaden that more widely, right? It's kind of the air pollution in general. So CO, and maybe I'll say CO2 plus, as well as the care that you all are taking in terms of where your water is coming from, so that you're not pulling from that really important potable water in a region that is water scarce.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start with the CO2 emission question. I might have to, as I talk, Angela, have you remind me of the water question specifically. But so there are zero operational CO2 emissions. We do this by self-powering any equipment that needs power during our operation. So these would be things like pumps and control systems. We would power those with our own energy. Or another renewable energy source with zero carbon emissions. During construction, there has been a lot of work done at Fervo to reduce construction emissions, which are a little bit harder to decarbonize, but are entrained in that life cycle emission calculation number that comes out for a project. So notably, we've electrified our drilling rig, which is the first electric drilling rig in the geothermal industry ever, which was a huge effort that came online last year. So we went from diesel generators to using local utility power to power our drilling operations. And so those are decisions that we're constantly trying to figure out how we can minimize our carbon emissions as well as noise and general air pollution for the community. Moving from diesel to electrified drilling rig not only reduced our emissions, but also significantly limited the noise that our workers that are working on our drilling rigs experience day in, day out, which is a huge safety benefit. So that's just one additional way that we're looking at how we can be a more sustainable and community focused organization. But for our operations, since we have a binary working fluid in our power plants, we use organic raking cycle power plants. We do not have that geothermal fluid with any potential entrained potential emissions that might come from naturally occurring rock properties in the subsurface. Those are all cycled back down into the subsurface. So they never see the air and never have a chance to escape. And so that's how we're able to, that and self-powering are how we're able to get to zero operational emissions. And then for the water piece, we water rights are very difficult to get in Utah. And that's just a period. But even if they were easy to get, we would want to be as cognizant of operating in water scarce areas and not impacting community lives through our operations. And that is just a mantra that we live by in all aspects of our project development, but specifically for water. We drill for brackish water on our site that would not be otherwise used for potable water sources. And as we're going to different project areas in the future, that is a continuous approach that we will take. And we'll make sure that we are acquiring the appropriate water rights for our projects based on that mantra of not impacting local communities and trying to be as self-sufficient as humanly possible.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. I see that we are just about to the top of the hour. I know that we did not get to everyone's questions. I really appreciate everyone's engagement on this webinar today, and that you did have so many questions. Mary, not Mary Dillon with Fervo, Mary with our events team at Clean Air Task Force, did put a message into the chat to everyone that if you do have another question, or if your question didn't get answered and you just really want to know, you can email events@catf.us, and we will work to still get you that answer that you're looking for. We also do have a few other events, as I had mentioned at the start of this webinar. one for the European audience tomorrow, as well as in November, we will have one on oil and gas and one on Canada as well. So you can find out more about those events at catf.us/events. And I want to thank our panelists just one more time. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Anne. And we really appreciate everyone's engagement today, and thank you for joining.